Welcome back again, gang. This is part 2 of our Chapter 13 lecture series. This part is entitled The Mexican War and Its Aftermath. The focus question for this section is, how did victory in the Mexican War fuel territorial expansion? The Mexican War was the first American conflict fought primarily on foreign soil. The war was inspired directly by this expansionist fever, this manifest destiny that swept across the nation in the mid-19th century. And the war was supported by a majority of Americans. Americans from all across the country, north and south, east and west, rallied to join the army to fight in Mexico. There were some, of course, who opposed the war precisely because it would expand slavery into those potentially conquered territories. And in particular, a very vociferous opponent of the Mexican War was Henry David Thoreau, who was a protege of Ralph Waldo Emerson and part of that transcendentalist movement. And his essay on civil disobedience that discusses his brief stint in jail for his refusal to pay taxes to support the Mexican War, which became the foundation for much of the civil rights discourse that would emerge in the mid-20th century, including a direct inspiration to Dr. Martin Luther King himself. The war itself took place on 3 fronts: California, New Mexico, and Mexico itself. But the bulk of the fighting occurred in central Mexico. Really, the war itself was not much of a contest. The American forces defeated the Mexicans pretty much in every single skirmish or battle that took place. And the U.S. forces occupied Mexico's capital city after a brief siege. The two governments at the end of the conflict negotiated the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which, along with the later Gadsden Purchase, which was a small little strip of land about right here in southern New Mexico, completed the present North American boundaries of the United States. Mexico to this day regards the war with a deep sense of resentment for all that territory that was lost in that conflict. Although to most Americans it remains just a footnote to American history. However, that is somewhat of a mistake, because the consequences of the Mexican War did much to further inflame those sectional tensions that would ultimately result in an even greater conflict, the Civil War. American victory in the Mexican War and the resulting increase in territorial expansion that came from it came to be seen as proof of the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race, which was something of a new parlance, if you will, at the time when it came to racial identity. This idea of an Anglo-Saxon race was defined by its opposites, by the opposition to black, to Indian, to Hispanic, to Catholics. Race at this time, and this is something that we've been discussing periodically off and on throughout these lecture series, was still somewhat of an amorphous notion in the mid-19th century. It was not merely about skin color. It drew together ideas of color, of culture, of national origin, of class, and even of religion. And there was particular concerns by some that Mexicans could not assimilate into American society, not only because of their ethnicity or their culture, but also because of their Catholicism as well, which, as we have discussed over and over again, was still seen as, well, something that was discriminated against by many Americans, particularly Protestants, of course, in this period. The American racial system proved detrimental to many inhabitants of the newly acquired territory, those ethnic Spanish and Native American Mexicans in particular of those regions. The rate of migration westward by Americans in the 1840s was kicked into extreme high gear when gold was found in California in 1848, and the California gold rush was sparked. The immigrants who came into California in search of fame and fortune and gold in this time were an incredibly diverse population. There was a sizable population of Chinese laborers who came into the region seeking their fortune at this time, and this further complicated the racial mixture of the region and increased racial tensions exponentially. Most of the migrants into California responding to this gold fever were young men seeking fame, fortune, and freedom from the constraints of life in the East that was primarily focused around wage labor and other such social institutions. Because of the huge variety of racial and ethnic mixture that existed and came into California in this period, the boundaries of freedom were tightly drawn in California. White miners in the region sought to minimize the influence of non-white immigrants. Limited voting rights were given to whites in this period. All others were excluded. The state, well, at this time, the territory was determined to reduce the Indian population through violence and the enslavement of Indian youth. Slavery was technically illegal in the California territory at the time, but persisted in some areas nonetheless. And this poster you see here is actually an advertisement for a young Indian slave girl that appeared in California in the late 1840s. Another result of the Mexican War was acquisition of the very crucial Pacific ports of San Diego and San Francisco. These cities were long seen as jumping off points for trade with the Far East, which was something that greatly interested the United States at the time as it sought to expand its foreign trade and economic involvement, particularly on the Pacific side of the nation at the time. Commodore Matthew Perry, this gentleman you see here, sailed a squadron of American ships into Japan and demanded that Japan open up American trade. And through the show of military force in the region, actually scared Japan into accepting a trade agreement with America. And Commodore Matthew Perry eventually established full diplomatic relations between the two countries. However, the exposure to the Americans, and especially the shock of the Japanese at the military strength of the Americans, inspired Japan to modernize at a breakneck pace. Prior to this period, Japan had spent several centuries essentially as a completely closed-off society that did not allow any foreigners into its territories and seldom allowed Japanese peoples outside of Japan. This exposure to the United States, and through that the wider economic situation in the globe, greatly influenced Japan to essentially try to keep up with the Joneses. If it was going to compete on a world stage or maintain its sovereignty and its position, then in the Japanese mindset, they needed to quickly match the power, both militarily and economically, with its Western counterparts. And by the early 20th century, Japan had become Asia's major military power, something that would have particularly dire consequences in the mid-20th century. Alright gang, that's it for part 2 of our Chapter 13 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.